Hello everyone, I hope I am audible and I hope you all have left with enough so that you can hear the last presentation of GSAS. So let me tell you first why this topic or why this proposal. So with my experience in architecture role for last few years, what I observed is many times as an architect we develop architecture design and then we probably end up in lot of stringent feedback loops which takes probably months and months, and by the time we send those design proposals to implementation team, either requirements are changed or those requirements are no longer valid. So what's the point in developing the architecture which is not satisfying the stakeholder needs? Neither we will be able to hand over those to implementation team. So this process was really taking huge in my experience. So I wanted to have something which will help you to define those evaluation with the ACE, with some probably cheat sheet like we have. Like if you ever used Linux, we generally have cheat sheet for terminal commands, right? Without cheat sheet, we would be lost with terminals. So my thought process was on the similar line. Why not if we could have some cheat sheet for evaluating architecture so that we can develop those architecture very quickly by considering all the aspects of non-functional attributes along with the evaluation process can be little simplified. So with this, let's dig deeper into the talk. So first we will just try to set the context what architecture is all about, why evaluation is important, what are the commonly used methods, what the research has been done in that line, what are the challenges with those methods, and then we will go through the proposed process I am going to say about, or the gist of this presentation. How many of you have seen this Winchester Mystery House or at least heard of this? Okay, good. At least a few hands up. So the diagram looks like this is really the beautiful house externally, but unfortunately it has lot of badly used architecture principles internally. So, and the Winchester Mystery House was, this particular house is in San Jose, California. This is owned by Sarah Winchester and named according to her owner. After the death of her husband and daughter, she wanted to build her house for her own, and what she did is like she kept on adding the rooms, she kept on adding the features, and she did not have the master plan for developing her house, and that resulted into a house which has staircase which leads to walls or ceilings. So what's the use of those staircase? It has doors which are opening into nothing. It has it has bathrooms which doesn't have the water system in it. It has chimneys which doesn't open always outside, and so on. So what's the point of using such architecture which looks beautifully externally but doesn't have useful features in it? So let's try to use this analogy to different thing, like for example traffic signal. If we try to compare what the architecture is all about, it's not about designing the light for traffic signal or designing the height at which we need to install the traffic signal. It's all about designing the traffic flow of a big city, how it will flow and so on. So how this type of architecture will help us to design a better system? So definitely it helps you to get the wider perspective, like many of, in many of the talks we heard that. It helps us to create the solid foundation, it helps you to have the bigger vision and so on. And eventually it will allow you to reduce the duplicacy and even reduce the cost. So do you all feel that just by designing the architecture, we will ensure success? Do you all feel that way? Probably not, right? How you will know that the architecture design you develop is solving the needs which it's supposed to? How you will know that the architecture you developed is really using the resources you had with optimal stuff. So let's see why architecture evaluation. This is popular comic, I believe, which explains. Which explains when customer explains something or when stakeholder explains something, he wanted something like this, the swing like this. When team like us, like architects design it, they think something is probably in this format. When actually programmer develops it is something like that, but this is not exactly what customer expected or customer wanted. So how do we really fill that gap on what customer said to us, what we developed, and what we designed, and actually what we delivered? And that is where I feel evaluation of the architecture is playing important role. So usually architecture design comes in between stakeholder needs and the implementation. So we generally gather the requirements from stakeholder, we try to develop the architecture design for that, and then we try to hand it over to implementation. But if we don't get the architecture design right, we will neither be able to satisfy the stakeholder needs, neither we will be able to get the implementation right. Probably we will just increase the technical debt. And to come out of that problem, my thought process was like, how do we really evaluate architecture? So let's try to understand first what the evaluation it actually means. It's the process of finding the effectiveness of architecture. How do you find that? That we will see it little later. So it's about improving the documents which generally we develop as architects. We develop data flow diagrams, we develop so many diagrams. But how do we really improve to make sure why particular decisions are made in that way, and improve those documents so that we can help ourselves in the future as well as others. And it definitely increases the stakeholder communication, because by asking appropriate questions to stakeholder, we will be able to get more clarity from the stakeholders, and we will be able to design the architecture which they are supposed to be, which they are really looking for it. And it is really intended for identifying the risk in earlier stages, because I think that topic was discussed a couple of times in last 2 days. The earlier we get the risk, I think it is better, it is easier to fix those. And same applies, like if we get the architecture right, if we get the risk in architecture design, it's always easier to fix those. And obviously it is not all about adding the delays in implementation or creating the documentation which is not going to be used in the future and so on. So when we are really talking about evaluating architecture, obviously it would need to have some measures which are really making sense. So I thought of like analyzing with or maybe relating it with the SMART criteria. So those measures should be very specific. What we are going to really accomplish with this, what actions we need to take it forward in order to develop this. This all information needs to be present in that architecture design documents. And obviously it needs to be measurable. What data will be used to measure? Most of the time the documents we develop as architects, those are not measurable. So how do we really measure those to make sure that it is satisfying the stakeholder needs and it is achievable? The architecture, we may develop architecture which is one of the best architecture for that particular solution, but is that something achievable? That is something we need to think about. Is it relevant? So many times we develop architecture by thinking certain things into consideration. So let's see, if we want to develop architecture which needs to stream lot of data, but without understanding the broader picture, if we just focus on streaming, we may end up using some technologies which are very good for streaming but may not be good for overall perspective. And time bound. Again, I think same thing applies. If we develop very awesome architecture but it cannot be delivered in given time, then it's of no use, right? So all those characteristics would need to be applied for that. And there has been a lot of research done in last probably 25 plus years. So what and those categories for that evaluation is based on 4 different things. Like first one is experience based. When it really comes to evaluating architecture, you generally go to expert architects and ask for their opinion, and they give you the gut feeling, okay, this architecture looks awesome, and until and unless they find something goofy, you will not be able to get any problems with that architecture, and most probably you were like gonna get it approval from them. Other type is simulation based. Many times many companies follow that POC stuff, like proof of concept. We develop proof of concept, and then based on that we validate whether a given proposal will work or not. Mathematical model is mostly used along with simulation, especially for the capturing the performance or scalability stuff, these quality attributes. And another one is scenario based. So you target certain scenarios and you evaluate architecture in that way, whether it's really solving for given scenarios or not, and then you can make a decision whether it's good architecture or not, and then move on and so on. So, and there are a lot of methods like developed, and there is a lot of research done, and these are like a couple of them I try to list just to give the glimpse of what those methods are, and what type of category they are using, and what are the quality attributes they are focusing on. So, like for example, software architecture analysis method, first one, SAM, is scenario based, where most of the focus was on modifiability as a quality attribute, and it was really allowing you to judge multiple quality attributes. And then ATAM was another scenario based, ALMA was another scenario based. There were a couple of simulation based like RARE, Argus, and so on. And like I mentioned, simulation based and mathematical modeling, mostly those two are clubbed together in order to define or evaluate the performance of proposed architecture. And then there are few more like EBAE, which is again experience based, ABAS is experience based, LQN, and so on. The list continues. There are a lot of methods. But how many of those are really used in practice in the industry? Any of you are using any of those methods for evaluation? Okay. Which one you are using? Okay, that's good. Any other hands who are actually using those in practice? So very few, right? Because, and a couple of reasons maybe, like ATAM definitely allows you to judge based on scenario, so it's always useful. If you get the scenario list properly from stakeholders, you can always relate it to whether the proposed architecture is solving your needs and so on. And LQN is simulation based. Many industries, we follow the POC concept, and that's really like extension for that. So let's see, like we saw there are a lot of methods, lot of research done in that area. So can we quantify the quality of architecture? What are you, like, there is a lot of research done in that. What is your gut feeling? Can we quantify the architecture quality? How best is that architecture? Can we quantify it? Yes, no? Maybe, depends. Yeah. So, yeah, we will probably never be able to get the best architecture, but at least we can try to get the good enough architecture by having some quantitative data around it. Let's see how I'm thinking to get to that quantitative data. So here, this is really the structured process to get some quantitative data for given architecture. So, and couple of steps are very general, which we use in our day-to-day life. First, we get the requirements from stakeholder. That's the first box talking about defining the requirements. Then another one is relating those requirements against software, like architecture quality attributes. This is exactly similar as something of fitness function. One of the exercises we did in yesterday's one of the workshop. So how do you relate those requirements against certain quality attributes? So for example, when you mention, I want e-commerce website which can handle millions of users at a given time. So that means probably you are looking for performance system, right? So how do you categorize the given requirements into certain non-functional category, non-functional quality attribute category? So once you do that, and that probably you can do with the help of architect. So here I put this box in the architect swim lane. Then once you really relate those architecture quality attributes with the given requirements, next thing is like getting the priority from stakeholder. I believe that is a very important step, and many times we forget that priority, because as an architect, like for example, I had done my master's in information security. In my early stages of career, I always used to focus on making sure the system I architect is secure enough. But that may not be need, right? Like for example, if I'm designing the system which is supposed to be running in VPN, I don't really need to care about security so much. If I'm not handling the P2 information or very sensitive information, I don't probably need to care as a security on top of my list, right? So that is where I feel those priorities would need to come from stakeholders, from whomever you are designing that. So once you get those priority, you can always focus on making sure the architecture you are developing is put in a right direction. So once you do that, next one is obviously you are going to go and develop the architecture design based on the requirements you got, the priorities you got, and so on. Here another step I added was like document requirements to architecture pattern mapping, and that is something which was even discussed in earlier calls. Like how do you enhance your architecture documents to include the rationale behind it? So for example, you capture the data flow diagrams, you capture the sequence diagrams, but how do you add the details of, okay, this particular data flow is solving this particular need, or rationale behind it? I think enhancing those documents is pretty good. It is good for ourselves also, because after a certain point of time, we may not remember why this particular architectural decision has been made in that way. So this is really talking about enhancing the ADs, architecture documents. And then the main part is evaluating architecture. So what I really came up with is like evaluation questionnaire for certain quality attributes against which we can evaluate that architecture. So we will be having prioritized quality attributes, and we will be having quality, like evaluation questionnaire, and I will go through those questionnaire a little bit in detail. So what I want to propose over here is like how you can evaluate given architecture with given requirements and given priority, and you have even the evaluation questionnaire. So these questionnaire will help you to evaluate the architecture, whether this is really satisfying the need for that, and based on that you can really come up with the score, and this will give you a good enough thoughts about, okay, this architecture is good enough. So if you have any uncertainties about that architecture, it will be highlighted at that place itself. And obviously if the score is greater than average benchmark, you can just go ahead with the implementation. If not, probably you would need to go back and refine the architecture and so on. So this is a really like little bit structured process to evaluate the architecture. So here I mentioned, or if you see my example, my diagram, I had used 4 actors in it. Let me clarify what those actors means. First one, I mentioned it as stakeholders. So stakeholders are nothing but individual, group, or organization that impacted by the outcome of an initiative to build the system. So it could be individual, it could be group, it could be organization, anyone. And those stakeholders should have a vested interest in that architecture, and who will have that decision making power. So those folks would need to be involved into that. Architect, I think as an individual responsible for developing the architecture, pretty straightforward. Another important thing I added into that diagram was evaluation team. So who should be part of that evaluation team? Who will be in a position to evaluate the proposed architecture? And here I try to categorize into 2 things. One is domain expert and another one is technical expert. So what is the rationale behind adding the domain expert? Will they have, like domain experts are probably nothing but some folks from the stakeholder who has deeper knowledge into the domain for which you are building the or designing the architecture. So will they add any value in evaluating the architecture? That's probably question mark, right? But the reason I added is like, if we build the architecture which is not satisfying the needs for stakeholder are not giving the business outcome, it's of no use, right? So whatever architecture we are developing, maybe layer 1 architecture, layer 2 architecture diagram is something which they can understand, and they will be able to help us to review those. Like for example, functional suitability is one of the quality attribute. They will be definitely able to help us. Can this proposed architecture help us to get to all the functionality which was needed? Yes or no, kind of thing, right? So that's the reason a domain expert was added. Another is technical expert, obviously. In the big organization, generally, we have architectural review boards who generally helps to review the architecture you are proposing so that the risks are avoided in the early stages. And when I mention technical experts are nothing but such experts into that domain. So let's see, for example, if you are designing system for managing the credit card information or very secure information, you would need technical experts who are experts in security. If you have some experts in performance, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because even in the architects, we have certain expertise. So my focus was like those technical experts and those domain experts should be pulled for evaluation team very optimally, which will really add value for that evaluation process. And development team is really the team which is going to implement this design system. Another thing I mentioned into that structured process was a couple of documents. First one was requirement document. Many times we get requirements in different formats, sometimes in Jira, sometimes in Smartsheet, sometimes in just Google Sheet, sometimes in a Word document or anything, right? So what I really want to add over here is like, we really need to have some more details into that requirement documents which will help us to design better architecture. So it should have a clearly the purpose of the system along with timelines, because if timeline is critical, we would define architecture which can be developed within that timeline. Otherwise, just full awesome architecture which is modular enough, which is using microservices, all latest stuff, etc., is of no use, right? All latest technology is of no use. So the architecture which can deliver value within given time and give the business outcome is something important. Another one I mentioned is architecture document, which is enhanced. I added enhanced word, and the reason for that is like including the rationale behind every architectural decision we are making for that diagram. I think that is pretty important. And then evaluation questionnaire will go into this. It's nothing but set of questions which evaluation team can answer, and it will help to assess the given architecture. So let's go little bit detail into evaluation questionnaire. So this is like list of sample quality attributes, and the list continues, right? It's a big list on Wikipedia. So I just try to pull very important 12 attributes, and the one which are bold over here is something I tried to come up with the questions against those quality attributes, which will help you to evaluate. And probably with this time, we can go with couple of them, and then in the appendix, I tried to add more questions too. So let's talk about little bit about performance. So what I did over here was, so all of you know that performance indicates the response of time to perform certain actions for certain period of time. So what I did was like, I came up with certain questions, and this is not mature. I really need all of your help in order to make this question set more mature, which can be used by whole community, and which I feel will be helpful to community as well as emerging architects. Because when I was starting with architect as a career, I didn't know how to interact with stakeholder. I didn't really had the cheat sheet, which questions I really need to ask to stakeholders so that I get the proper architecture designed for solving the respective need. So I had a thought that if I had a cheat sheet which will help me, okay, if I need to build a performance system, I need to consider what are the design patterns I need to use so that I can optimize the compute resources, optimize the persistent storage, and so on. So these questions are really based on little bit generic questions, I would say, but the way scaling I used is yes or no. Yes can be like 5 and 0, or 5 and 1, and then the 5 scale rating really. Very easy, and these questions can really have different scale, but I try to focus it on 1 to 5 as a scale. And you will have the architectural document, you will have the requirements, and you can try to assess the architecture by asking a question, like for example, are measures taken for response time to meet the system requirement? So for example, if system requirement is handling the millions of users for given time, like in minute, let's see, and if you are allocating just few GBs as a memory, may not be sufficient, right? So you would need to make sure the measures are taken so that whatever system, wherever that system is deployed, is acting performantly, right? So those kind of, like what pattern you are really using in order to make sure the system requirements are met. Next one is like, are measures taken to monitor the performance of given system? If we are talking about creating a performance system, and if we are not measuring the performance, it is of no use. So we would need to take certain measures in order to make sure we capture the performance or monitor the performance. Then obviously we would need some alerting mechanism. Just by capturing or monitoring performance will not be helpful. So we need to have some alerting mechanism. And on the optimizing side, obviously we would need to work on optimizing the compute resources, persistent storage. So let's see, for example, if we are building a caching system, it may need little more storage than other microservice which is not using caching, or which is just simply doing some processing. It may need little more compute storage. So have you done that optimization when building that architecture? And are measures taken for routing optimization? For example, when we talk about we need response time pretty less, are you making sure the application deployment is done in the zones where user is sitting, or from where user is accessing those APIs or web, whatever you are developing, and so on. And how easy is to, like, because whenever we say we want to build a performance system, how easy is to test the performance of the system? Many times we forget about testing and creating the load or generating the load which can be against that particular system, and so on. And it is how easy to scale up resources in given in case of heavy load, and so on. So these are some of the questions I really came up with, which will help us to get certain characteristics applicable to given architecture. On the same line, I came up with security. So security, again, it has data stuff, what type of data the given proposed system is handling, what are the security measures you have taken in order to make sure you are securing the data in transit as well as securing the data in rest. What are the environments being used? Are you anonymizing the data which is being pulled into lower environments or development environments, and so on. And again, I really use the same scaling mechanism, which is 1 to 5, and if evaluation team can just answer those questions, it will generate the score out of it. And the list continues, like for security, what are the measures taken to store the password if it is using if it is having some authentication? Are there any key management guidelines used? Are there any dynamic security testing being used, and so on? So that's for security. Yeah, I think I try to add others in appendix. If anyone is interested, we can go through that. Recently, for my last project, we tried to apply this particular technique in one of the pricing architecture we were developing at Red Hat. And generally, for getting the feedback from evaluation team, it used to take probably a month or 4 to 6 weeks. But with this method, we were able to get the feedback in probably less than 24 hours. So that was really beneficial for us because we were able to make fast progress or make the fast move for this particular project. Otherwise, in Red Hat, at least until you get the sign off from ARB, you cannot move forward. So we tried to, like, whole purpose for this was like, how do you really ace the evaluation process? And obviously the question set I came up with is probably not mature because I just applied for one architecture design. I think I really want to bring it back to community and ask community to help to get that question set more mature so that that can be acted as cheat sheet for emerging architects as well as for experts. It can be used for evaluations and so on. Yeah. Last but not least, thanks to all the sponsors and thanks for giving me opportunity to speak over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pranjal. We don't have any online questions.
That's good.
Let's say. No, we have. Sorry. Okay. I think your quality attribute taxonomy for evaluation is super red. How do you train new evaluators to use it? Are there common problems new evaluators struggle with?
Could you please repeat?
Okay, so one of the attendees asked, I think your quality attribute taxonomy for evaluation is super red. How do you train new evaluators to use it? Are there common problems new evaluators struggle with?
So evaluators, right? Yeah. Okay. So in my opinion, when we talk about ARB, Architecture Review Board in Red Hat, is like many times as an architect, we fail to give the context to ARB, why this particular architecture has been designed in that way. So that was one of the challenge, and that's where I really wrote it as enhanced architecture document, because without having details on what particular pattern is being used for solving which particular problem, it was hard for ARB. So it was like really back and forth discussions. Okay, why you are doing this way? Why are you doing this way? Why this is particular thing is being chosen, and so on. So that was one of the challenge, at least I had seen in Red Hat. So probably having those enhanced documents will help to overcome that challenge. That was the thought process, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you have plans to put your questions on GitHub in order to get community input?
Yeah, sure, I can, for sure. And that is one of the major aim. And as a Red Hat, we always believe in community contribution. So here also it's no exception. I am definitely looking forward for community feedback as well as contribution.
Okay. How do you collaborate to create the cheat sheets? How often do you modify them?
So currently the one which is over here is recently developed by me. So I took some feedback from some of the expert architects in Red Hat, but I feel in the next few months it will have a lot of modifications as we try to use it at multiple places. But yeah, once we get little mature, probably there will not be more modifications.
Okay. What do you do after you get the evaluations?
So once we get the evaluation based on result, if there are a lot of uncertainties given into that particular evaluation sheet, we sometimes go back to architects and ask to refine certain things. If those are fine, then we straight away go to the implementation. So that's the pattern we follow.
Okay. Where do you store this? Wiki?
So internally in Red Hat, currently it's on our Google Sheets, which are shared across whole Red Hat company. But I'm planning to put it probably in community where everybody can access. I don't know whether those slides will be shared. If not, if anyone is interested in getting those slides right away, please let me know. I'm happy to share those.
Okay. All right. Considering that no list of quality attributes is complete, how can we facilitate a more democratic process for this cheat sheet? Open source, maybe?
I'm really thinking it as open source, probably putting it on GitHub so that everybody can have access.
When you can recommend gather evaluation team, don't you think this function can be done by architects themselves?
Ideally, yes. I think when somebody is really developing, once they have that cheat sheet, they can definitely use it. But they may not have the clarity on, okay, this is definitely, this particular measure is definitely useful for solving this particular problem. And that is where expert opinion really helps. So yeah, in the starting, if architecture development itself is being considered by considering these questions by architects, I think it will become little easier for evaluation team also, because all those points are already being considered for developing the architecture, right? So evaluation will not have back and forth lot of comments. So it will definitely reduce the time frame for evaluation process.